Let the mighty be humble.
First of all, I have to say this hyper beam attack is very sick and a completely new experience in Genshin, so I'm sure a ton of you are going to have a blast playing him. So I got my hands on Neuvillette for an early review, and I thought it would be interesting to take you guys through my thought process in understanding what he does, building teams around him, as well as weapon and artifact calculations. Just bear in mind that my testing account is limited to level 80 and pretty mid investment, so it's difficult to get a full gauge of things. So I've been using Neuvillette for maybe a minute, and it's quite clear he is a DPS, HP scaling DPS that you will be using for big damage on field. Now immediately I'd think, because he is a Hydro DPS, I'm thinking about Mono Hydro, Yelan or Ayato teams like this and slotting Neuvillette in there. Or you could think about a vaporized team like this and putting him there. But it's not that simple, because he has some twists, both good and not good, that complicate things. So first of all, his charge attack is the core of his kit, and his normal attack combos don't seem to be very useful, aside of maybe applying Hydra at the beginning of a setup just so you can swirl that. But what this means right away is that he's not really synergizing well with Yelan or Xingqiu, so that immediately impacts his team building. So this beam, it fires a max of 8 hits for about 3 seconds, and that's 8 hits if you're constantly hitting an enemy. And from my testing, you can't speed this up through attack speed buffs like maybe from Jean or from Mika. And this charge attack has a wind up, and originally it takes about 4 seconds to cast, which is obviously very impractical. But the gimmick with his kit is that you can remove this wind up time to just 1 second by just absorbing 3 droplets, which are these little orbs, and 3 of these are produced from his skill and 6 of these are produced from his burst. And each droplet you absorb reduces this wind up time by 1 second. And you can't pick them up with other characters, you just pick them up when Neuvillette uses his charge attack. He also has healing and HP loss mechanics. The charge attack reduces 8% HP every 0.5 seconds, so 48% HP for a full charge attack. But just before you use that charge attack, each droplet you pick up heals 16% HP. So it basically cancels that loss out. 3 droplets just from his skill, he doesn't really gain nor lose HP, but I did notice the temporary HP loss during his charge attack can make him vulnerable. And using both his skill and his burst is very important for this charge attack, because if you want to do more than one charge attack at a time, you want to pick up 3 droplets one time and then 3 droplets again. He's also got this Ascension 4 passive that boosts his damage the higher his HP is, but since he loses HP during his charge attack, which is the core damage part of his kit, this buff seems less relevant. You can be high HP during his burst or skill, and they're only a small part of his damage. And overall, I think his skill and burst are more relevant for making droplets than anything else. So here's my weapon calcs and just some initial disclaimers. Since mostly on this channel you only really see me calculate characters and teams I extensively play and I understand well, whereas obviously this Neuvillette testing is early, so I'm definitely not saying these calcs are perfect and they might not be using the most optimal playstyle. So onto the actual weapon comparisons, and the main thing is because he's a HP scaler, it means most catalysts you just won't really use. You can see I only have 3 weapons here, but that's because Prototype Amber is craftable, so it's very free to play friendly, and there's no reason to use random catalysts that are not mentioned here. And it also heals the whole team, which is pretty cool, albeit it's nothing crazy. There's also the new Battle Pass weapon, Sacrificial Jade. It gives crit rate and HP, and as you get more and more refines, it can give more HP than Prototype Amber. And it's pretty strong in between both his Signature and Prototype Amber, but the advantage the other 2 weapons have is they both help with its energy generation. So Sacrificial Jade is kind of the hardest to build around. You need to build more ER, and especially combined with the Hunter set, the weapon and the Hunter set give so much crit rate, so you might need to worry about not overcapping on crit rate too. And then lastly, his signature weapon is obviously his strongest weapon. It gives a ton of crit damage and it synergizes really well with the Hunter artifact set, and it gives HP and it also buffs his charge attacks, and as I said before, it gives him energy. Now if you look at these numbers, 34% stronger than the free to play option is quite significant, but That's just an unfortunate thing you might have to accept, at least until more weapon options come out. On the other hand, if you're a battle pass buyer and you are able to get sacrificial jade, as long as you can get a good build for it, as you can see it's very strong and can even get very close to a signature weapon. Also, my calcs are with and without Archaic Petra on Zhongli. Archaic Petra, as you know, is an artifact set that gives damage bonus, and the signature weapon gains a bit of value without Archaic Petra just because it also gives damage bonus to its charge attack, so that's slightly saturated with Archaic Petra. However, I will say here, actually using Archaic Petra can be pretty difficult in practice, and the calcs with Archaic Petra assume you're able to fully buff him up before his damage windows, which when I playtested it ends up being pretty annoying, so I wouldn't focus too much on the calcs with Archaic Petra. Overall conclusion on weapons, I would say each weapon does have their own issues in terms of overall useful substats. If you remember in my substat video, generally for most characters around 30 to 35 useful substats when you add up each substat in your artifacts. That's where you want to end up generally for finished builds, but the signature weapon and prototype amber value energy recharge less, and sacrificial jade values crit rate less, and even in electro charge teams I doubt he gains much from elemental mastery, and obviously attack is useless on him. So I would say overall it's quite difficult to build Neuvillette compared to other characters in the game who have so many valuable subsets. For artifacts, the Hunter set, the new set with Fontaine, is his best set by a mile, and you really need to farm this, and if you don't have it already then I highly recommend start grinding for it. And you can stack this crit rate very quickly with the droplets and his charge attack losing HP. Also, remember to factor in this crit rate for your final builds. 3 stacks of this 12%, so 36 crit rate means 64% crit rate on his build is 100% when this passive is fully stacked. So try not to overcap. And I also calculated mix sets, which as you can see are much weaker, but you can use these mix sets temporarily until you get a proper hunter set. So 15% hydro damage, 20% HP, any of these sets, whichever ones you have. But it's also important to know that 17% damage difference is roughly equivalent to 8 or 9 offensive substats, which is basically an entire perfect artifact worth. So there's such a huge difference, it shouldn't take you that long to upgrade from a mix set. For ER ballpark recommendations, obviously that depends on your team, if you have Favonius weapons on supports, how often he uses burst. But from testing various teams, overall he seems similar to Ayaka, Eula, Shao, a lot of other characters, and for builds I would say around 130% seems to be a good goal, and that should be able to cover most scenarios. I also wanted to compare different main stats, so I compare Hydro Goblets or HP Goblets or HP Circlets. And to be honest, the differences don't seem to be very significant. As you know, 2% is about 1 crit substat, so these differences aren't massive, and overall you should just be using whichever pieces have the better substats. If your HP Goblet has a lot more crit than your Hydro Goblet, then just use that. Same thing with the HP Circlet. And also I did compare it also with Sacrificial Jade, since the weapon does give HP itself. So a HP Goblet is slightly weaker if you're using Sacrificial Jade, but it's still a very minor difference. So let's get into team building. As we've noticed, he doesn't have hyper armor or interruption resistance or much invincibility when he casts his charge attack, and his charge attack is a very significant part of his kit and probably a very significant piece of your overall team's damage. So making sure he can do his charge attack is very important. This means it's fair to say he needs defensive utility even though he does heal, to make sure he is able to cast his charge attack, as well as also keeping him alive when his HP gets low from using a charge attack. Technically, not having a healer can reduce the damage buff from his Ascension 4 talent, but then again, as you can see, he loses so much HP when casting charge attack, it's very difficult for a healer to make much of a difference. Another key thing you need to know when building a team is that his Ascension 1 talent increases his charge attack damage when hydro reactions occur up to 3 times, and each reaction counts for 1 stack. So if you figure it out, this pushes him away from having a hydro teammate, unless you are fighting an enemy with an element aura already on them automatically. But in most situations, to get this max buff, you would use 3 different elements on his team to get 3 different hydro reactions. This damage buff is also a unique multiplier. It's not damage percent bonus, so at 3 stacks it's literally 1.6 times the damage. This is similar to Yoimiya's skill, or Wanderer skill. And that also does bring another issue, because not having another Hydra teammate will lower the energy he gets in a rotation, so it will lower his burst uptime. His burst is vital for more droplets to lower his charge attack wind up time and let you do more than one of those. Also, one cool thing is that Kazuha and other animo characters can suck in these droplets, and this can make it more easier to absorb them when you use a charge attack. Speaking of Kazuha, I do think he's Neuvillette's best teammate, at least at the moment. I think first of all, before getting into anything else, we have to acknowledge that because Neuvillette's charge attack is a straight line of destruction, and in many ways, especially with a hyper team, this attack is most of your team's damage. So you really want enemies to be nicely grouped for it. I think it can be similar to Ayaka in that way, where having enemies neatly grouped and frozen is so important for her burst damage. So overall with this, whether you have Kazuha or not, you really want to pair him with an animo grouper. You could use Sucrose or Venti too, but Kazuha's advantage over them in one aspect is that he has shorter cooldowns on his grouping. His skill has either a 6 second or a 9 second cooldown depending on whether you used his press or hold, and this makes him feel very seamless. In comparison, Venti has a long burst suction, but it's basically up for 8 seconds where you have great suction, but then 8 seconds where you have no suction, since his skill just deals damage. Whereas Sucrose can group with both her skill and burst, but especially once you run out of skill charges, the cooldowns on both of these are so long. For other animo characters, you could also use Hazel at C2, maybe Jean if you wanted to. Another advantage for Kazuha is Neuvillette being a HP scaler. He doesn't have access to as many buffing teammates like an attack scaling DPS does, and all animo characters can use the VV artifact set for debuffs, which is a huge multiplier for Neuvillette's damage. But Kazuha's other big advantage is his damage buffs, and he can also combine this with utility with his weapon like Xiphos or Favonius Sword if you want to help Neuvillette get his burst faster, or Sacrificial Sword if you want more grouping, or even Freedom Sworn if you want to increase Neuvillette's charge attack damage. And unfortunately, other teammates don't really have this level of utility. Overall, I found that basically Kazuha was the only real perfect teammate for Neuvillette, and the main problem with team building was figuring out what to do with the other two teammates. We should also discuss Hydra teammates, and it doesn't seem like he has much synergy with any of them. First of all, you might prefer another element to do reactions with in order to maximize his A1 talent and maximize his charge attack buff. So a Hydra teammate means unless you're fighting enemies you can naturally react off, you won't be able to get this full charge attack buff. But it's not necessarily a deal breaker though, since you would be trading this buff for Hydra Resonance and the HP buff you get from that. So double Hydra definitely isn't a problem forever, but I think that's just one of the reasons why it's a problem now, which is that the Hydra characters themselves don't really have great synergy with him. Kokomi's healing can be nice to keep Neuvillette topped up and helping his survivability, but overall I noticed that healing is less valuable and you really want a shielder instead to stop him getting staggered during a charge attack or during your setup, especially after you've used charge attacks when he's on lower HP. Plus he can't benefit from her using TTDS to increase attack either. I suppose you could use Yelan for her damage buff and then also getting the HP buff from Hydra Resonance, and then you use her attacks as sort of a double DPS. But honestly, the only people who I would expect to do that are the very high invested Yelan players, maybe having a lot of constellations. So a double DPS team like that could be strong, but probably won't be a very relevant synergy for most of you guys. Mona seems to be okay. Unlike Yelan and Xingqiu, Mona doesn't care about normal attacks in her team, so she can be fine. And her buffs are similar to Yelan's but a bit stronger of a damage buff, but it doesn't really last that long. It should be enough for about one charge attack. She also isn't that great of a Hydra battery either. This skill doesn't consistently generate much energy and I wouldn't rely on it at all. No Hydra teammates can be a bad situation for him, because if we look at the rest of the Hydra roster, I can give tons of examples. With Yelan, one of our best synergies is with Xingqiu. Ayato likes teaming with Yelan, Kokomi works with Nilou, Yelan, Xingqiu, Mona supports Yelan or Vape Nilou very well, and Nilou can work with basically everyone. So all of them, aside from Child, who is basically locked into International, all of the Hydras get a head start on team building, since they have good synergy with at least one if not more Hydra teammates. and most hydros scale with HP too, so they benefit even further from hydro resonance. So I noticed this allows for a more plug and play synergistic team building, and when you build these characters teams, your third teammate can be a buffer or some sort of damage amplifier, and then you just need one more character in your team, which is usually pretty simple. And in comparison, something I noticed is Neuvillette is very unfortunate because since at the moment he doesn't have this easy hydro synergy, it's quite difficult to build his teams, and it basically means you're short one teammate. And to use an analogy, it kind of feels like you have to scavenge around in a leftover box of things searching for any teammates. Still, and this is quite important to think about, is we are in Fontaine, the Hydro region after all, so I'm sure there are a lot more Hydro characters to come this year, and it's possible Neuvillette is in a similar situation to Nilou or Sino, where they actually designed future characters to work well with him, especially more synergistic Hydro teammates. I'm pretty sure just the Hydro Resonance HP buff and the synergistic energy battery, those will be worth more than building a multi-element team just for this charge attack multiplier, but for now all we have is speculation. And at the moment, losing Hydro battery means his burst ER requirements will always be high, and that also makes his rotations long. So to me it actually makes sense why they designed his signature weapon like this and why it comes with energy restoration. So building teams, you have Neuvillette and you have Kazuha, and you want a shielder, and Zhongli is very good for this. This can form the, you can say, hypercarry core, since both Kazuha and Zhongli will be buffing Neuvillette too. The issue is figuring out the final teammate, and for a final slot I just threw in Fischl. As we know, she is a character you can often just splash into teams for off-field damage, and her electro attacks also help with getting his max charge attack damage. And you can also use golden troop pieces that you get whilst farming for Neuvillette's artifacts. Also, as you know, Fischl, when you alternate her skill and her burst to keep Oz's uptime high, this works well with longer rotations, 24 seconds plus, so this does work well with Neuvillette's playstyle. However, there's no quicken or aggravate to buff Fischl's damage, or an electro DPS to increase her Ascension 4 talent activations, and her damage is single target focused, so overall don't expect a lot of damage. So just my thoughts on this team: hypercarry or taser or electric charge, whatever you want to call it. They feel good, but there's still a lot of issues at the same time. I will say in these teams there's too many things to keep track of, and it doesn't feel good having so many things you need to set up, like having to juggle Kazuha's buffs, using Fischl for Oz, especially using Archaic Petra on Zhongli, swirling both Hydro and Electro with Kazuha. And even though I saw overall potential with this team archetype, it just feels way too complex, and at the very least I don't think I would recommend Archaic Petra here. You will lose damage without it, but at least you don't have to worry about running around with Zhongli. So also, I know I'm complaining about Fischl, but it really is hard to find better alternatives at the moment. Let me show you what I mean. So if I lower the difficulty a bit, which would simulate if I had better builds on my team, and then I'll play a very simple setup, and I'm not going to care about buffing Fischl or overcomplicating things.
Wind strike.
Be sanctified.
Clouds high. The birds come.
By royal decree.
See, that feels right to me. And look how clean that was. So you can tell he feels much more natural to play if you don't need to worry about buffing multiple elements and having very complicated setups. We just need a Fischl replacement, and then hypercarry will be at its full potential. So here's what I would like to see. Like, I'm thinking, imagine if Ayato's burst did more damage, or even he could be more of a support if his burst did less damage but it provided some team buffs. This is how I'd imagine a more synergistic teammate. Then you could cast his burst. I could actually swirl that.
Solidified. Bow your head. Be sanctified.
Then I could do Neuvillette's charge attacks.
Solidified. Bow your head. Be sanctified.
And it's just a lot more smoother to play. Just some sort of easy to play off-field teammate, and I don't need to worry about buffing Electro or buffing Cryo. And yeah, like I said, they can be more of a support or they can be more of a sub DPS. I think if future characters can be either of those options, it would be way nicer to play than Fischl. I also tried Beidou. She was pretty good replacing Zhongli. Her shield is pretty weak, but you still get this interruption resistance and damage reduction from her burst. And Fischl also helps with Beidou's energy problems, so it wasn't too bad. There was a few downsides though. Obviously, she doesn't buff Neuvillette's damage like Zhongli does. And then on top of that, because you're using 2 electros, your charge attack multiplier will go from 3 stacks to 2 stacks. But she still felt like a decent option. Aside from Hydro teammates, there aren't that many splashable off-field characters you can use, so Fischl probably is one of the better ones for now. But this is another area where hopefully he is designed to work better with some newer characters. I really think if a support buffer or a sub DPS who has longer uptime than Fischl's Oz, those would simplify this hypercarry setup greatly, especially future Hydro characters. If they can battery each other, that would also solve Neuvillette's energy too. So I also did try out hyperbloom teams, and of course they are always very friendly and easy to play. Great teams for consistent casual abyss clears, where you want enough damage to clear but you don't want to try too hard. And I think Neuvillette is no exception. In fact, in comparison to the taser team, especially with Nahida and Raiden's skills which last such a long time, these hyperloom teams definitely felt more comfortable to play. But the issue is I don't think these teams really play into Neuvillette's strengths at all, and I think some of you guys will feel unsatisfied with hyperbloom. There's no real damage increases or damage buffs for him in these teams, aside from being multi-element teams, so you get the maximum charge attack multiplier, but there's really nothing else. And then on top of that, in a team like this, there's no anima grouper to set up all the teams nicely for his charge attack. So that in itself, if you're fighting multiple enemies, I find you're probably just waving his beam around, trying your best to line up enemies. And to solve both those problems, I did try adding in kazuha and then replacing Raiden with Shinobu for healing. But having both Nahida and Shinobu complicating the elemental application, it makes it inconsistent for kazuha to swell Hydro for buffs, as well as Shinobu herself, forcing Neuvillette to be at close range rather than being able to utilize the range of his beam. And she doesn't help with providing interruption resist either. I did find Baizhu really nice. He has healing and interruption resist. He felt like a great replacement for Zhongli if you do want to play hyperloom teams. Although I probably would play him with Nahida, so like Neuvillette, Nahida, Baizhu and Raiden Shogun, since Baizhu doesn't have the best danger application by himself. But this felt like a pretty comfortable team. The only issue is, as you can see, there's 4 5-stars, so it's definitely not the most accessible team. I just want to briefly touch on his Constellation 1. It does 2 things, interruption resistance, and it gives 1 free stack of his Ascension 1 talent. I don't want to go into this too much since this is a C0 review, but his C1 increasing poise is very huge, especially since throughout this review I've mentioned how shielding is very important for his charge attack consistency, and this Constellation does solve that. Instead of a healer, you could replace that teammate with someone more offensive, or even adding a crucial reaction that you couldn't before in order to build more stacks of his talent. But mentioning that, it also lowers his need for adding more reactions since you do get the free stack of his charge attack buff. This Constellation is kind of similar to Nahida's C1, which also gave her a free stack of her own buffs. In conclusion, honestly, it was pretty difficult to get a good gauge on Neuvillette, since one, this account was limited to lower investment, so it was hard for me to gauge things from that regard. But also, I think you guys will notice this whilst testing, Neuvillette really does feel like he is missing the teammates that he was intended to synergize well with. Whether they come next patch or the patch after or in a couple of months, I really do think aside from Kazuha, there are some missing characters there for his team. But I don't hold that against him. I can tell from playing him that he feels really good to play, and he should have very strong damage potential. And I'm sure some of you guys will be able to get great results even now. But me personally, I wasn't able to find a perfect team for him that buffed him fully and played to all his strengths. For anyone pulling him, I highly recommend you are patient with him, and I hope you guys found this review helpful. It was my first time doing a day 1 guide for a character, so hopefully you enjoyed this change of pace, and thanks for watching.